Hello, thanks for listening to the Finance Leadership Podcast. It's the latest update and news about the Finance Leadership Programme. It's produced by AICPA and CIMA, together as the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants. You can find out more at aicpa-cima.com or enroll.cgma.org. As usual, listen to myself, Kevin Burnley, and today I'm joined by a fellow Irishman, Hugh Martin, to talk about the strategic case study exam. So for anyone who has the exam booked and is pending, sitting in the next few weeks, this is definitely worth a listen. So welcome to the podcast, Hugh. Thank you for joining. And could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Thank you so much, Kevin. Really appreciate it. Yeah. So my name is Hugh Martin. I'm Irish. And basically, I've been teaching, writing. I've been involved with the FLP, various different CIMA offices, kind of focusing the last 5 years or so on the case study exams. So kind of getting students through the case study exams. I've worked probably in the last 2-3 years for VIVA Financial Tuition as a director of content. So I've seen lots of students go through the qualification, and we've had lots of prize winners the last few years. I'm really passionate about helping students, as I said, get through the qualification, become fully qualified and move through their career progression, really.
Fair to say, Hugh, that you've seen lots of weird and wonderful case studies come your way. It's funny, I was talking to another tutor last week, a guy from Kaplan, John Bennett, about a case study involving saddles, which, to be honest, I have absolutely no knowledge of whatsoever. So after we spoke, I actually had a full read of the pre-scene, which I hadn't done. So, a very interesting subject. And from someone who's been around a while, you can see where the examiner might test. So regarding the strategic case study, which is coming up in a few weeks, what's this case about?
Yeah, so you're right. There are huge varieties in the different cases that come up. And there's certainly been a few over the years where, I'm nearly reading it 2 or 3 times to kind of understand what's going on. And thankfully, this is a fairly straightforward one this time around. It's a security company. So it's a service-based business. So for some students, that can be good or that can be bad, kind of depending on their personal experience. The company itself, it has kind of 2 main services that it provides, physical security services. So that would be like when you go into a retail store and there's a security guard at the door and they're checking to see if people are possibly taking stuff, that type of service. And as well, they offer intelligence-led services. So corporate investigations, risk consultancy, training, and penetration testing as well. So it's quite an interesting business. It has different regional offices. So that's something that's quite important for this pre-scene. The offices are based internationally, and that happened before with a case. It was called Pixel Whiz. And what was examined in that case was translation risk and all those types of things that happen when you have overseas subsidiaries. So I could see that happening with this pre-scene, which I think we'll talk about later on. It has lots of international customers, so that's brought up in the pre-scene lots. And it seems to be a very big business. So it employs tens of thousands of consultants. It's a very, very large business. It's a listed business. It has the standard breakdown of directors. So there's 4 non-executives, there's 5 executives. Interestingly, there's always kind of something new with every pre-scene. This one has a director of legal, which we haven't seen before, a director of legal and ethics. So it kind of shows possibly where the exam scenarios might go. Not really too certain, but generally speaking, when you see something like that, it may end up coming into a scenario in some variety. In terms of the main risks that the business faces, I think that's really important. Risk management is a big part of the SCS. They face big currency risk. As I said, it's an international business, so translation risk, transaction risk, and so on. Recruitment is a big factor. It's a service-based business, so they're very people-dependent. And it also mentions, health and safety risks. So possibly having a consulting contract overseas, and maybe the country is dangerous and so on and so forth. There could be political risk that could be tested. And then they have this big issue around reputation risk. So I think probably one of the most interesting things about this business is, well, they're advising on risk. So if a risk happens for them, naturally that's going to affect their reputation. and possibly discredit them as a business. So it's an interesting one. It's fairly straightforward. It's not too out there. It's something that I think people could relate to. In terms of what it's based on, I would say the business G4S. So I'm sure we're all familiar with G4S. You'll see, there are security guards in retail stores and civil service buildings if you're in the UK, and various other places as well. So I think that's what it's sort of modeled on, which is always useful to kind of look at outside of this PC analysis.
Yeah, and it wouldn't take long to run a Google search to see some of the risk issues those companies have faced over the years and some of the reputational challenges, shall we say, based on performance or perceived performance in the past. So that's one probably a search that most people should actually do. But yeah, you can see when you're involved in that industry, you got to be what you profess to help others to do, I guess. But in terms of the main themes of where people should focus their time, obviously you're looking at strategic levels. So, everything from enterprise risk through to cybersecurity. And then obviously, international businesses always scream things like, hedging your currency and stuff like that. Have you any key areas, Hugh, that you think could be tested? If you were a student studying an exam, shall we say, where would you focus your time?
There's a standard set of scenarios that you could nearly apply to any pre-scene, but I think this one has some unique ones, to be honest with you. So one that sticks out for me, and this is something that came up when I was writing mock papers, so looking for scenarios. At the very end of the pre-scene document, sometimes there's articles, and those articles in the past have set the scenarios for some real exams. And one of the articles is around the degree of force that a physical security guard can actually exert. So they're apprehending someone. To what degree can they apprehend? And I think there could be a scenario tested where, possibly one of Saefwell's security guards goes too far, maybe hurt someone, maybe misunderstood the situation. You could have ethics tested in that case. You could have reputation risk, stakeholder management. Those types of things could come up. As you said, and you're completely right, cyber risk is a really big part of the syllabus, and it's quite a broad topic. So in this case, it could be the provision of services. Maybe something goes wrong. Maybe the company gives bad advice, and then there's a cyber related incident for its client. Or maybe it's a case that, Saefwell goes to the dark web, as it's noted in the pre-scene, and they warn other companies about hackers, and those hackers are, they're not happy, and possibly they're a target of ransomware. So that came up before, and there was a question around scenario planning. How do we manage this? Reputation again, calming capital markets. New business is one that kind of comes up quite often in the SCS. So, moving into new industries or launching a new business or buying an asset. In this particular case, I could see maybe moving into the private prisons market. Maybe you could have questions around ethics there. Is it right? Is it acceptable for shareholders and so on and so forth? You could have possibly purchasing a forensic accounting firm. That's kind of hinted in the pre-scene as well. And those questions, those scenarios are typically formed around raising finance. How do we fund this new venture, possibly acquiring a business, valuing that business, the impact on share price. Those types of questions come up quite a lot. And I think the last one is exactly what you said, is managing overseas business. So it could be the case that they have a big client overseas, and the client's country, maybe there's an issue with the government, political risk, and there's subsequent issues with the currency and interest rate and the international Fisher effect. That's all been tested before in the past. So I think those themes are really important. Of course, and you said it correct, there's no real way of knowing exactly what will be tested, but those types of scenarios, pretty safe to bet one of them will come up in some variety.
Yeah, and obviously there are a finite amount of scenarios, but it's the way they test and it's the nature of the questions, and sometimes the perceived ambiguity or multi-stage questions that students can get troubled with. As we know, the strategic level is the least of the technical levels of the syllabus, but is there any technical areas that you would focus on for the exam or really brush up on? I mean, when we say technical, it's nothing like the IFRS or the complex variance analysis or budgeting or forecasting that you get at area levels, but things around your F and P pillars. P is largely non-technical, at strategic level. It's all dealing with risk, financial risks and debt and equity finance, for example. Is there any of those areas, Hugh, that you see students struggling with in particular?
Yeah, certainly. So, the last 2 years, I've probably seen, in the thousands of mock paper scripts, and there's definitely repeated trends, where students struggle. And what we will normally do is if there's a topic that is an issue, we'll retest it so that we're confident that students can approach it in the real exam. And as you said, one of the biggest is raising long-term sources of finance. So this is a repeated theme in the SCS. I think since the 2019 syllabus, there's pretty much been a question on at least one variant around raising long-term sources of finance. So, a rights issue, what does that mean for the business? What are the problems involved? What impact will it have on the interpretation of the financial statements? Those types of questions. Even raising debt. Generally speaking, the questions are quite straightforward, but they're normally answered quite poorly. And I think it's a really important area to brush up on, because it's the type of area that you could bring into other types of questions as well. So if you're asked to evaluate a strategy and you're looking at the acceptability or the feasibility, you could kind of integrate elements of financing there. So I would think that's probably one of the most important ones. For this particular pre-scene, I think currency risk is really important to understand. So being able to evaluate currency risk, understand the link with interest rates. So the international Fisher effect has been tested before, and translation risk has been tested before as well. And understanding how those can be evaluated. So not just understanding, okay, currencies change, that could be good or bad, but understanding the impact of that on the business. What does that mean for things like debt covenants or gearing ratios and performance management? Those types of themes have been tested before. So knowing it quite well, not just a kind of a surface level knowledge. Another technical area that we've seen, sometimes students struggle with is business valuations. Hasn't been tested loads, but it has been tested recently around valuing a business that is maybe unlisted, has lots of intangible assets, maybe it's not even profitable. How do we value that business, or what are the difficulties involved and how could we overcome those? That's a very common template for an SCS style question. What are the issues and how do we approach those? So business valuations is actually quite straightforward. Again, there's a limited range of issues that could come up. So knowing it well will really serve you for the exam. And the last thing I would say, Kevin, is understanding share price movements. So this has been tested so many times on the SCS over and over. And understanding things like efficient market hypothesis, what impact will an event have on the company's share price, or does the share price movement make, or should it make a difference to a decision or something like that? Those types of scenarios have come up a lot. And again, the variation is very slim. The same type of question has been tested repeatedly. So knowing those, great idea, great to have.
The valuations one in particular, I think, is probably quite likely if I was studying this, because it's a services business and there's always complications around, as you say, intangible assets. And, there's never been a greater focus on this when you see some of the overinflated valuations of tech companies in recent years. As an example, we have students who progress through OCS, MCS, and then they're coming to their strategic level. In terms of the approach for the exam, clearly it's the same format, the same setup, the same duration. Is there anything in particular that you would see as a major difference? Even time management issue can creep in anywhere in exam, but is there any things that you see a very obvious role if MCS is really different because SCS, or any key points that you bring to bear?
Yeah, I probably had this question quite a lot in webinars and any sort of outreach we've done at the SCS level. And it's a very valid question, because the OCS and the MCS are similar in some regards because they're very internally focused. As you were saying, with financial standards, they're tested quite heavily for both. Whereas with the SCS, there are no financial standards necessarily tested. So the exam itself is, it's more focused on the wider impacts that can happen on a business or a business can cause in its environment. Just in terms of the technicals for the exam, each section is 60 minutes in length, which means that you have 33 marks per section that you need to achieve. Whereas with the MCS and the OCS, you only had 45 minutes, but there were 25 marks to achieve. So what does that mean for the student? It means that their answers have to be a little bit longer. So just even thinking about it from a very basic level, one of the biggest differences is that your answers should be a little bit more in depth. And in terms of the answers that you're providing, they have to have a little bit more context in them, whether that context comes from the pre-seen, or maybe it comes from the question, the information in the question, which is called the unseen information, or maybe it's information from the industry. What I actually mean by that, so maybe people are thinking, well, what does that mean? That sounds nice. It just means that your answer needs to make sense in the context of the industry. So in this particular case, for example, with Saefwell, it's a service business. And as you said, it can be very difficult to value service-based businesses, especially just based off memory. About 70% of the company's non-current assets are intangible in nature, goodwill or intangible assets. And so if you go into your exam and say precisely that makes sense for this business. If you were to go into your exam and say, well, we should raise debt and we should use all our non-current assets as collateral, there should be no issues. That doesn't really make any sense. So those are the kind of considerations, just as a very basic example, that you have for the SCS. It has to kind of make sense within the industry. And thankfully, with the pre-seen documents, especially the more recent ones, the first 10 or 11 pages are just going over what you need to know for the industry. So you don't have to be an industry expert or spend loads of time online. It's a good idea to spend some time, looking at the real world. But there's a lot of information in there that kind of helps you get to grips with the industry and understand what is the norm. So I think that's a big difference. The other thing is I would say that at the SCS level, you have to know the pre-seen a little bit more. So it comes into the exam in lots of different ways. So you might have questions around specific board members, the mission statement, vision, core values. So if you know those in advance, it really makes it a lot easier to answer the questions. So I would say the big things are the answer length has to be a little bit more substantial. The answers have to make a little bit more sense within the industry. And the other thing is, as I said, you have to know the pre-seen really well. It factors into the exam a little bit more than the OCS and the MCS.
Great, thanks. The strategic level requires you to think strategically. Now, with students who may not be at that level within their career yet, have you any advice on how to move your mindset, strategic focus? Because clearly you're writing for a different audience. You have to think longer term. You're thinking about how the company's been viewed by external stakeholders. And obviously there's a huge command now put on companies around ESG and governance, etc. Is there any advice you have for when writing your answers, how to think strategically?
Yeah, it's a really good point, because I suppose a lot of people might be working as, trainee management accountants or financial accounting spectrum, all the different roles that are involved in that. And they may be thinking, as you're saying, well, how do I think like someone who's at, almost a CFO level or, at a senior level, which this exam is sort of pitched at? I suppose the first thing is to get to grips with the industry a bit more so that you have a better idea of the external environment. So as we said, just even going through the pre-seen document, a lot of people skip the pages that are not actually related to the company. So that's a very fundamental step, is just kind of understanding the industry and getting a sense for what's going on in the world in regards to this industry. So we said earlier, look at things like G4S, or just have a Google of different security companies. There's one called Securitas as well. It's a massive company. And just get a sense for what's going on. What you will see on Google News or Yahoo News or Bloomberg is very much at a strategic level. So you'll get some sense for that. And the other thing is to get a sense for the answers that you should be providing, which, as you're saying, are more strategically aimed. Going through past exams, which are available on the CIMA planner, it really helpful because it shows how you should be answering your questions and how broad the answers need to be. So going through past exam answers and past exam questions, it should give you a sense for how you should be pitching your answers. So I think that helps. Practice helps a lot. So I know it's something that students are probably sick hearing. It's very easy for me to say it as well. But if you practice doing mocks, looking at the answers that you're giving, comparing them to solutions, or maybe even getting someone to mark your paper for you, it does help because you compare where you're at to, an ideal solution. As well, when you're reading the questions, and it is difficult to do this, to be honest with you, but try as much as possible to think of the words wider considerations or wider implications. So thinking about, let's say, for example, the company raises finance using debt. Don't just think about the ratios. So that's probably a little bit more at the OCS, MCS level. Think about things, as we said, like the share price. So that's wider implications of raising debt. So how would the shareholders feel about the company raising debt? You're thinking outside of the company a little bit more. So those types of considerations are typically what a good SCS answer would encompass. So just thinking outside of the company. And really, that comes with practice. It's easy for me to say it here, but to be honest with you, you have to practice it over and over. And I think that's the best way to study for these types of exams anyways.
Yeah. Anyone who's ever heard me online or listened to one of these podcasts or listened to a webinar, mock exams, totally.
Exactly.
Through and through. And as part of your FLP subscription, those are included within the preparation for the case study. You would be amazed at how many students still do not submit all their mocks for grading. So I don't want to sound like a school teacher, but you need to do your mock exams. It's the best preparation that you can possibly get.
Yeah, I agree with you. It really is important. And it's the same for any tuition provider. There's always a ratio of people that don't submit them. And it's unfortunate because you're completely correct. It's such a powerful study tool. And to get feedback on your answers is also as difficult as it can be sometimes, you haven't performed well, but it's still really important.
Absolutely. Great, Hugh. Well, thank you very much for your contributions today. I appreciate it. I think it's a good place to end our conversation now. So thanks for taking the time speaking to our students today. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you. So there's plenty more to explore on this topic in the show notes. So all the usual links will be provided. To view them, just click on the episode's info icon in the podcast app or on your smartphone or tablet, or open the episode in your computer's browser. You'll find everything you need there. As I said, there's more information. You can go to AICPA-CIMA.com or go to the enroll.cgma.org website. Thanks again to Hugh, and thanks again for listening. If you know a friend or colleague who could use this information, feel free to share with your networks. You'll see the sharing buttons on the podcast app. That's it for now. We'll have another episode very soon. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.
This content is designed to provide illustrative information with respect to the subject matter covered and does not represent an official opinion or position of the AICPA, the Association, or CIMA. It is provided with the understanding that they are not engaged in offering legal, accounting, or other professional services. If such advice or expert assistance is required, the services of a competent professional person should be sought. The AICPA, the Association, and CIMA make no representations, warranties, or guarantees as to, and assume no responsibility for, the content or application of the material contained herein, and especially disclaim all liability for any damages arising out of the use of, reference to, or reliance on such material.